If you weren't with us for the last couple weeks, or this is your first time, what you need to know is that we started a series a couple weeks ago called Attitude Check. And the design of that series is to do just that, to check our attitudes. Our passion as we open the scriptures is that we see a God who invites us to live our lives with a certain kind of attitude, irrespective of what's going on around us. And I recognize that that could quickly and easily be confused for something that's shallow and empty and, that you find in a certain section of the bookstore where you stick your head in the sand and you say everything's hunky-dory when it's not. And that's really not what we mean by it at all. But that there is a God who in the scriptures continually invites his people to live with a certain type of attitude irrespective of what's unfolding around them. And in fact, the metaphor, the picture that we've been using from the very beginning has been to say, what if we imagined our attitude to be like a muscle? Right? Because muscles can be in shape and they can be out of shape. We won't take a raise of hands. They can be healthy, they can be unhealthy, they can be attractive, they can be unattractive. And we've said, what if our muscle is the exact same way? That far from being destined to having a certain type of attitude, right? Because somewhere around third grade or your freshman year in college or something like that, you took a test, and part of the outcome of the test was, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist, right? And so for the rest of your life, you've been telling your husband, like, I'm sorry, honey, you just got to live with it. I'm a pessimist. Or we say that to our bosses, or we say that to ourselves. And I'm with the field of science that is saying more and more that our personality is formed early on and it's unchangeable. I'm not convinced that our attitude is a part of that, largely because when I look at the scriptures and you look at psychological science, you see that it's something we can do something about, that it's a muscle. And that therefore, like a muscle, if you wanted to have a certain muscle in shape, you would do some exercises. You would intentionally practice some disciplines that would put it in shape. And that's the way we've been talking about our attitudes is, You can't just grunt your way like, good attitude. And that's kind of what we've been learning, right? Like throughout our lives, we've been told just like, get your attitude in shape. Well, that's hard. And it's borderline mean because it doesn't give us anything to do other than like not be something. And so what we've been saying is, what if there are these exercises that we can do that actually can, not overnight, not even in a month's time, but actually can turn the direction of our attitude. And so last week, if you missed it or are interested, I encourage you to grab a podcast or a CD, but really the gist of last week was this idea of feeding our minds good stuff. And really the idea is that your mind has a metabolism, that it consumes. And much like your body, it'll consume what you give it. And if you give it junk food, that's what it'll consume. And much like your body, your attitude will reflect what you eat. In fact, I think a friend of mine summed it up really well in talking about a guy named Jack Groppel, who we'll talk about next week. He's this kind of behavioral science dude and getting kind of performance guy. And he says if 80% of the time you'll just eat what you know you should, then 20% of the time you can do whatever you want. Which is not an invitation to binge drinking, by the way. Like, we can take that too far. It's not an invitation to binge anything. But that if 80% of the time we'll do the right thing, then 20% we can do whatever we want. And I think that's really what we were saying last week, is watch out for the mental junk food and be more intentional about feeding your mind good stuff. This week, I'm indebted, by the way, in this series to a guy named Tim Sanders, who wrote a really, really good book, one of the best books I've read in a very long time, that kind of puts a lot of these handles on there. And he uses this phrase, moving the conversation forward. So this week we're going to talk about our language. Before we do, I've got a video for you. Okay, so I think probably for most of us, as we talk about this idea of moving the conversation forward, we're probably all familiar with the conversation about the influential power of words. And I think probably all of us have some memory of some incredibly hurtful thing said to us in a moment of rage that probably wasn't premeditated, but nonetheless has lodged itself in our guts, in our soul, in our heart. And we've probably all been on the receiving end of both haphazard, accidental words, if you will, and intentional, premeditated, hurtful, harmful stuff. And yet, to be fair with the conversation, we've all been on the giving end of that as well, to a spouse, I'm sure, or a child, or a friend, or a boss, or a coworker, or a coach, or whatever. And on this topic of the power of language, I think James, the half-brother of Jesus, has these remarkably brilliant things to say. In chapter 3, which I forgot to get back to the beginning of my Kindle doc. Now, no whammies. Remember that TV show, No Whammies? Remember that? What was that called? No whammies? What? Press Your Luck? Yeah, there you go. That was a good show. We all stumble in many ways. So those who are never at fault in what they say are perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. So good news, James is saying. If you say stupid things, you're in good company. It's with the rest of humanity, because he is saying that your ability to hold back in the language you use might be the ultimate symbol of self-control. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Now, a conversation about the influence of language probably for most of us would be review, because we're familiar with that. We know that. And to be sure, James stands on the shoulders of a rich history of revelation history known as the Bible, because from the very beginning of God's extending to people their need for grace and giving them the best way to live, that gets kind of fleshed out in the stories of those in the text, he's been telling people, watch out with your language. It has creative power. It is dynamic in its influence. In fact, the book of Proverbs, which is this compilation of wisdom, and if you're kind of eager to start reading the Bible but don't know where to start, the book of Proverbs can be a great place to start. It is filled with all of these instances about the power of language. In 10:19, it says, sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent, they hold their tongues, which means Adam's not prudent. 12:18 says, the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. 15:2, the tongue of the wise adorns knowledge, but the mouth of the fool gushes folly. 28 says, the heart of the righteous weighs its answers, but the mouth of the wicked gushes evil. In chapter 17, there's two that are back to back. Those who have knowledge use words with restraint, and those who have understanding are even-tempered. And I think my favorite, even fools are wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. So again, this would be review. Where I want to drill down this morning, where I want to kind of provoke you to think and wrestle and maybe introduce some new disciplines and habits to your life this morning, isn't so much with regard to the consequences of your words upon the lives of others, because that's where the conversation always goes. And whenever we open up the Bible and start studying what it says about language, it's always like how my words impact your life. And for sure, that's important. My interest this morning is, what is the impact of your words on your own life? I mean, as we talk about attitude check and your attitude and checking your attitude and introducing disciplines into your life that can help you with your attitude, I guess my interest is, how do your words influence your attitude? How do those things that you say steer, if you will, as James says, like the rudder of a ship? Maybe today he would talk about NASCAR, that the slightest word, how can it cause the strongest change of direction? And why is it that whenever we think about words, we think about others, but never about our own attitudes? I mean, what if the smallest complaint, maybe about a boss, what if it really does impact your attitude at work? And not only does it impact your attitude at work, it impacts your production at work. And what if that statement you say to a coworker about a coach, or a boss, or to a teammate about a coach, well, what if that can grow to the extent that it moves beyond the original realm? So no longer are you a complainer just about your boss, you're a complainer at work. No longer are you a complainer just about your coach, you're kind of the disgruntled athlete on the team. And no longer are you the disgruntled athlete on the team, what if it can grow further from there? To where now you're the person in the home with the bad attitude. Now you're the person with your friends, among your group of friends with a bad attitude. I mean, what if it can grow to where suddenly you have a bad attitude towards your job and your marriage, and your future, and your God, and your community, and your church, and your network of friends, and your finances? I guess what I'm suggesting is, what if something as supposedly trivial as a statement about the weather? Right? Because I think we're all in this together. We have this habit of beginning conversations, and one of the easiest ways to do it is to grumble about something. I guess where I want to challenge us is, what if that's by definition unhealthy? And what if it's unhealthy because of the way that something said about something trivial grows? Maybe we could use this image. Maybe complaining is like a domino. Woo! Like Star Trek. And that thing we say about a kid, about a marriage, about a day, about a person, about a coworker, about a screaming kid in the basement. I mean, that thing that we say, what if it's not isolated? What if it doesn't stand alone? But what if it grows? And like a domino, like a snowball, what happens is it leads to another, and 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 it leads to another. And before you know it, that little statement about your boss as you walked in the door, or about your coach as you got to practice, or about a teacher, or about your parents, or about the weather, pretty soon you spent the whole morning with a bad attitude. Or pretty soon, you spent the whole day, or you spent your whole career working for that company, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing, like which happened first? The job stunk or you had a bad attitude? And what if it gets really, really circular really, really quickly, and you kind of can't find your way into the answer because the two are so interconnected? And before you know it, it leads to another, and you've spent your whole marriage, the whole time your kids were little. Or maybe worse, you're that guy, and they bury you, or you're that gal and they bury you, and the kind of thing that goes unsaid at the whole deal was, man, that guy had a bad attitude. I mean, he was such a complainer. Nothing could ever be right. And the sad thing is that those guys, those gals, they don't ever know it. Because what if one little complaint can so steer our hearts, so steer our attitudes, that before we know it, our whole existence is engulfed in complaints? I mean, what if language has that much ability? What if the words you say really can create your state of mind, your emotional health, your perspective? And what if a person with a good attitude can endure some circumstances that a person with a bad can't? See, I think on this issue of the creative power of words, the Bible actually has a lot to say, because if you're a biblicist, if you're someone that values the Bible and believes that it's more than a human book, that it's given to us by God, that it's a history of narratives about God's pursuit of people and that he loves them despite the fact they're broken as broken can get, and his revealing to them what it means to be fully human. If you believe that about the Bible, then literally from the first pages of the Bible, you are confronted with the power of language. Just check this out, and I think you'll figure out where I'm going before I say it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, my interest isn't the age of the earth or anything like that. Follow me here. Now, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and you're going like, you lost me. Yeah, lost lots of people. And there was evening, and there was morning the second day. And then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. And God called the ground, dry ground, land, and gathered the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, verse 11, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. What if we live in a universe created by a God, and that universe that he created a system, and the system was like language creates reality. That words aren't trivial, they're not insignificant, they actually have catalytic creative power to them. Now, can that go too far? Yeah, everything can, right? But isn't it interesting that in Genesis 1 we get a God who creates, not with a hammer, with language? I mean, is there something more going on there? Is there a passion on God's part for us to grasp and get and accept that? My friend Derry Long is on staff at Journey Church in Bozeman, one of our mother churches, and he's kind of in charge of kind of networking the pastors within our denomination from this region of the state. And so we get together quarterly for these lunches, and recently we were having lunch, and he was saying that he was talking about marriage and how somehow he got on the subject of his 7th or 8th year of his marriage, and what he was explaining, which we all knew, was that statistically years 7 through 10 of a marriage are the hardest. I mean, you ask people, and predominantly those are the hardest years of a marriage, and he was saying that happened to him and his wife, and they're still married, they're in their 60s, but it happened to them in about that 7th year. And he was like looking for answers, and he was reading books, and he was getting all the help he could get, and then somewhere he stumbled upon this idea that every night before he went to sleep, while he and his wife were laying there, he was going to say something nice to her. He was going to compliment her about something. And of course, he was telling us the story because now as a man in his 60s, he's looking at a bunch of 30-something men going, that changed the culture of my marriage. Why? Well, because in Genesis 1, we learn that words have creative power. And wouldn't that also shed a different light on so many other scriptures in the text? Like in Ephesians 4:29, a verse that I'll invite you to read, invite you to memorize this week if you're kind of trafficking with us in the memorization of verses on this series. Paul says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." So all this has me wondering. I've always understood Paul's teachings as really moralistic. Like it's wrong to do that to others. I wonder how much Paul understood that the Ephesians, if they talked poorly about other people, it would impact their ability and thus their ability to carry out and love each other like he was calling them to. It wasn't just about good or bad, right and wrong. It was about attitude. Or in Matthew 12, one of those instances where if you need a Jesus who seems to be fired up and has the backdrop of flames, that's one of them. But I tell you that people will have to give an account on Judgment Day for every empty word they've spoken. I mean, that's intense. Because I'm a Bronco fan. Wow. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you'll be condemned. Now, again, is this a moralistic God who just has the power to be God and thus he can arbitrarily pick right and wrong, good or bad? Or is this a God who is saying to us, you'll be judged? Like, we're all able to live once and to be judged once, and we will go before God and be judged, and we're judged by grace. We don't earn our way into heaven, of course, but we're still judged with what we do with that grace. Grace empowers us to live the life God calls us to. And is Jesus saying to us, hey, check this out. Your words will matter, because I'm going to judge you for the life that you lived, and the life that you lived will be a reflection of the words that you used. When you think about your attitude, last week we started by saying, think about what you're feeding your mind, because none of us is as creative as we think, and none of us is positive as we think. We need stuff that fuels that. I guess this morning my challenge is, what about your words? Tim Sanders, who, again, we have this book here this weekend, and if you want to grab it, it's available up here. The way he puts this is that we have internal and external conversations. There's words that you say in your head. You're not alone, right? Like, we all do that. It doesn't make you evil or weird or anything. Like, we all do that. And there's words that never leave your head. Praise the Lord. There's those, but there's also words that do. And there's the things you say. And so we could separate these two concepts between internal and external conversations. My challenge to you this morning, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to kind of back up the dump truck on you and give you 5 ideas related to internal and external conversations. 5 things that I think you can do to mitigate the way you use words. And then I'm going to invite you to back the dump truck back up on me and only take one of them with you. So in ways that aren't totally narrate culture, I'm going to kind of inundate you with some ideas and then just invite you on the back end. Just go with one. So let's start with the internal conversation. First, I want to read a quote from Tim Sanders. He says, the internal conversation stands as the midpoint between your thoughts and your actions. No matter how much good stuff you put in your mind, if the internal conversation is distorted, you'll still produce negative thoughts. Unlike real food, you have a choice when it comes to how you'll digest your mind food. You have complete control over the internal conversations, to which some of us are going, really? I do? Because I don't feel that way. First tip, he calls frame the news. Here's what this looks like. Did you know you have two centers that process information in your brain? You have an emotional center, which is located in your brainstem. You have a logical center, which is located in your frontal lobe. I'm not a scientist, but for some reason I feel smart when I say frontal lobe. Better if I had an English accent. You have 2 places, literally. And the deal is this. Your emotional center is not only the primary place, in other words, stuff happens, circumstances unfold, someone says something to you, someone pulls out in front of you, things happen. It hits your emotional center first. In fact, have you heard all these conversations lately? It's a fascinating study. I'm in the middle of one right now myself called emotional intelligence. Have you heard about that? And it's kind of this vernacular we all use, but none of us really knows what we mean. Emotional intelligence, if we could just boil it down to like Adam's intelligence level, it's simply the connection between your emotional center and your logical center. Someone who's emotionally intelligent is someone who is able to inhibit the emotional response while their logical center gets a shot at it. If you're someone who, like, your reaction before you go to bed is not at all representative of your reaction after you wake up in the morning, that's an emotional intelligence issue. It's an inability to hold back your emotional response. It is why, by the way, why the Bible talks so much about discipleships or mentoring or relationships in growing in Christ. Because the issue is we become emotional about things, and outside sources don't. They don't become emotional about your stuff. They only become emotional about theirs. It's why we're so passionate about marriage mentoring around here. It's not because you need someone who's smarter, though that can't hurt. It's not because you need someone who's been married like 20 years longer, though that can't hurt either. It's not because you need a professional or someone that's right next to Jesus in the spiritual health category, though none of those things can hurt. It's about marriage as an emotional deal. And a couple who walks with you and processes marriage with you and lives life with you and you have dinner once a month or whatever, what they can do for you is they can just usurp the emotional center and go right to the logical. because your stuff doesn't make them be emotional. So here's how this lands with Tim and the whole controlling the internal conversation and framing the news. If you think about it, you have three types of news in your life. You have good news, you have neutral news, and you have bad news. And yet, I think it's very astute of Tim to say, really, there's actually four categories, because there's two types of bad news. There's the type of bad news that you can't do anything about. We tend to call that tragedy. And then there's the type of bad news that really it's not bad news so much as it's get busy news. It's not the end of the world. It just means things aren't going the way you worked. It's going to cost more than you thought it would. It's going to require more work than you thought it was. You're going to have to patch the hole in that wall. Not the end of the world. But it's work that requires you to get busy. And what he means by frame the news is when something happens, if you'll frame the news and determine, hey, wait a minute, not the end of the world. I just have to get busy. Well, when you make that determination to get busy, does that force you to be positive or negative? It invites you to get into the logical part of your brain and start problem solving, which requires you to be positive. Example of that, though I am certainly not the poster child, my emotional intelligence is low, which is why I'm studying it. Example, Sarah forwarded me an email on Tuesday at about 5:30, end of the day. I'm getting ready to walk home, and I read this email from Tom, the guy who leads the Grand Street Theater, saying, essentially it said this, hey, I hear that you guys are putting an extension ladder up into the lights, and you're messing with the lights, and the result of that is not only dangerous, because that's a long ways up, but the last weekend at the 3 o'clock show on Sunday, there was a dark spot on the stage, and obviously the gist of it was, could you not do that anymore? Now, that makes me nervous. Because what I understand in the context of all that is when we showed up for the first show, when they were having their first show of this particular set, we had two options because every light up there was either pink or blue. So we could either do like Smurf Church or we could do 1994 fluorescent pink church. Neither of which is a good option. And so we kind of framed the news and we went, well, we got to get busy. And we grabbed an extension ladder and we said, James, would you climb that extension ladder, please? In fact, Kyle Ball was literally standing next to him and he said, you're on workers' comp, you climb the ladder. So I called Tom. I know this is the situation. And I say, Tom, I'm really sorry. We worked really hard to leave the place better than we found it. And we have a great relationship. And I wasn't saying that to him. I'm telling you that. And as I explained it all, he went, okay, great. A lack of emotional intelligence, had I not framed the news there, what do? You freak out, you get mad, you start forming these arguments before they ever happen. You start complaining about them and how much they want you to fail and all this different stuff, none of which is true. Option two, tool number two, you might say, in frame the news is this idea of accepting, I always want to say face the worst case. Face the worst case means this. You get the news, and you just kind of, here's the worst case scenario. Here's what it's going to be. Worst case scenario is we can't put the extension ladder up and change the lights. And then, he says, you just make the determination that you're going to go one left of the worst. You're going to elicit your creative, overcoming energy, and you're going to make the determination that you're going to do one better than the worst, which for us was the determination I made in my head was, well, worst case scenario is we got to get here about a half an hour earlier than we normally do, and we got to get in the trailer, and we've got to set up our tree stands, because we have two of them. You might remember them from the Cinemark. They were like rapture lights up at the top of the stairs, and you couldn't see anything, but there were these 8 lights that we had, and we don't have to use them here because we have theirs in the ceiling. Worst case is we have to pull those out of the trailer, and we got to set them up, and we got to run cords, and we got to put them on the balcony stairs, and that'll be a pain because all of you people up there will be like tripping over them, and if you touch them, you'll be tattooed for the rest of your life, or that's what we'll tell you it is a tattoo. Doctor will tell you it's a burn. Worst case is that. And you just go there, and you use all of your creative energy to go there, and then it's typically not as bad as you think, right? Okay, let's talk about the internal stuff. On the internal stuff, Tim Sanders says this: the words and phrases you use fuel conversations to move forward, sideways, or backward. If you inject negativity into your conversations with others, you'll generate negative thinking in yourself and in your partners. And then he quotes a psychiatrist who says this: not only does language reflect a person's thinking, but it also reinforces a person's thinking. First one, this is the one of the 5 that I choose. It's the one that I'm the worst at, and, well, is just leave it unsaid. And your mom's been telling you this since you were 4. If you don't have anything nice to say, just don't say it at all. Let's talk about the cornucopia. Just sounded fun. Seen one of these? Did your grandma have one and it was dusty and decrepit and you kind of wondered, like, what is that gross thing with the false fake grapes and like you put your teeth in there? Like, what is that? Tim tells a story that he was raised by his grandma, and part of his chores involved dusting. And one day, as he was dusting, as he did every week, he was dusting the family cornucopia that was much older than that and not nearly as good looking as that, and it was covered with dust, and it was a dust magnet, it was gross, and he finally said, Grandma, what's with the thing, right? He didn't know it was called the cornucopia, neither did I until Wikipedia this week, or the horn of plenty. And she said, well, here's the deal with that. She said, I was raised during the Great Depression. And we came home, my dad came home from work, and we sat around the kitchen table, and what do you suppose we did? We just got more depressed. You just sat around the table and you talked how bad it was and how much worse it was going to get and how so-and-so lost their farm and so-and-so had to close their business and so-and-so had to get rid of some kids. I mean, you just talked about how terrible it was and how much money you've lost and how horrible the future looks. And she said, one day my dad came home from dinner and we all sat down, and sitting in the middle of the table was a cornucopia. And of course someone said, what is that? What is with that thing? And she began to explain, it goes all the way back to Roman mythology. It's a symbol of plenty, and even the pilgrims used it to kind of symbolize this abundance and God's provision in this new land that they were in. And she said, so here's the deal. From now on, at this kitchen table, we're not talking about the bad stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff, and we have a lot to be thankful for. And she started listing health and the fact that they still lived in a house and the fact that they were a family, and she started listing and went on and on and on. And she said, so here's the deal. We're going to talk about the stuff that we can control, the decisions we can make. Of course, Tim, decades later, writes, in my view, one of the best books on attitude ever written, one of the best I've ever read. Why? Because his grandma changed the culture of his life by saying, okay, first and foremost, even if you're thinking it, just don't say it. Just leave it unsaid. Paul says it this way, do everything without grumbling and complaining. Not easy, but it's a good place to start. Second thing is this idea of talk about ideas. Talk about opportunities. My aunt used to have a magnet on her refrigerator that said, small people talk about people, medium-sized people talk about events, big people talk about ideas. Just talk about ideas, which requires that you feed your brain. I think it's what Paul was getting at when he said, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about that. Talk about that, perhaps. And then number 3, exercise what you might call exercising your gratitude muscle. Learn to be grateful, which kind of makes it fun because we're in that season where we're supposed to be grateful, but really we just want to eat turkey, right? Just learn to identify the things you can be thankful for. Another example from my life. So our offices are above Riley's, and we love our offices. They're great. I love it. We do though I do have one complaint, and I've had it since we moved in there. The glass is single pane. I can see outside through the trim. Though that's not my complaint, but literally I can see daylight through the trim of the window, but I don't pay the heat bill. My complaint is that across the street from our offices is a loading zone. And a lot of you guys have diesel vehicles. It's unbelievable. And everybody who delivers anything drives a diesel, and they don't turn diesels, like they build them in the factory and they start them and then they never turn off again. Which means that the crack in my window becomes ventilation. So I smell your diesel, and the UPS man comes, or the FedEx man comes, or the bank man comes, or Chad comes, and he parks illegally, and he gets his coffee, and I just hear diesel. And I've learned to get over the diesel thing, except for there's the mobile shredder truck. Are you familiar with that thing? See, Micah, everyone needs to drive one of those little trucks like you, because they don't make any noise. That's what everyone needs to do. Anyway, there's the mobile shredder truck that shreds bank documents and stuff like that, and it's the size of the Empire State Building. The biggest U-Haul truck you could buy. It's that size. It's diesel, and when it parks there, it's there for at least an hour. And while it's collecting all the papers and stuff, it idles, and when it gets all the papers in there, they don't drive to East Helena or Montana City and do the shredding. They do it right on the spot. I'm guessing that's part of the service, part of the security deal. I understand the business plan, but the shredder runs on the diesel engine. So when the thing is shredding its paper for 15 minutes, the engine is at 2,500 RPMs, which I'm not a mechanic, but I understand that diesels don't get that high, right? I mean, it's completely revved up, and it's incredibly noisy, and I hate it. And I walk into Lenny's office, we both hate it, and we have this thing, and I walk into his office, I haven't done this in a while, dude. He's like, dude. It's horrible. So this summer, I bought a knife, and I slashed his tires. Just kidding. Not that I'd tell you. So this summer I was working on all this, and I'm kind of going like, well, yeah, gratitude muscle. How can I turn this? How can I turn this in my head? You know, it's kind of like, at least they get the number one pick in the draft, that type of turning. Oh yeah, it's Thursday. And I kind of started going through this process like, it's Thursday. This is awesome. It's here on Thursday, which means it won't be here on Friday. And that's usually when it comes. And Friday's a pretty big deal in the preparation of the weekend. Yes, it's Friday, and I'm having this little party in my office like, the truck is here on Thursday, yes. It's tacky, but you get the point. Exercise the gratitude muscle, leave it unsaid. I don't know how it lands for you. I guess the thing that I want to leave you with is this challenge of, what if your attitude is directly formed by your words? And that you don't have to live with that attitude. You can shape it. You can change it. And not only is your mind central to that, but so are the words that you use. You know, the early Christians, they were made fun of literally for the word hope. It was a foreign concept. And it seemed silly to the Romans that these people could have hope in the midst of particularly what Christians faced pre-Constantine. It seems to me that we follow a God who's a God of hope. And I understand, I don't want to trivialize the real hurts, the real issues that you deal with in life, the real stuff that you could logically form an argument and win your case in court, that you have the right to have a bad attitude. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe this isn't about winning court cases. This is about living with the mental health that Jesus invites you to live with. So I don't know which of those 5 is relevant to you, whether it's the frame the news or the go to the worst case scenario, whether it's just leave it unsaid or talk about ideas, not people, or to simply work on your gratitude muscle. I just would encourage you to grab one of those. And then if you're up for the challenge, grab Ephesians 4:29 from the ushers as you leave and memorize that. Because I think your words, they don't just change the direction of a marriage or a kid's life. They don't just affect your friends. They affect you. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for language. And we all here collectively just kind of say thanks, because that's central to what it means to be made in your image. And it's this incredible resource, this powerful tool that you've given us. Sets us apart in so many ways from the created order. And God, this morning is not about shame, so I pray that you would lift that off of those of us who are just recalling these incredibly horrendous circumstances and we've already sought forgiveness for. God, we're delighted to represent you, to serve you by being a people of a different type of attitude. And so would you help us in the days and weeks and months that follow to work on our attitude muscle by the words that we use. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name that we pray. One more challenge on that. Pick one. I forgot to mention, I'd also challenge you, pick one and tell somebody which one you picked. Create a little bit of accountability in your life that you can grow into in the next several months. We're going to continue to worship.